Welcome back to another Excel VBA tutorial. So today we are going to cover what I would definitely call is an advanced topic in the realm of VBA. We are actually going to be taking a lot of different topics that we've covered over the last year or whatever, and we're going to start merging them all together. Now in this particular video series, we are going to explore how to take list objects, so data tables like you see in front of you, add them to a data model, create relationships from those tables, create measures from those tables, and then also take all of that information and put it into some type of report format like a pivot table. So you'll notice here, I have a pivot table that is referencing these two tables, but more specifically, when you start exploring some of this, you'll notice that there's measures in here and that both of these exist in the data model. So if I go to my data tab, I'm going to notice that if I go to my queries and connections, I'll notice that I have connections to those tables and then also data model connections as well. So this is really putting together a lot of different concepts into a single series. So I will say this. If a lot of these ideas look very confusing to you, I do have video series that cover each of them independently. So if you want to learn about list objects, I have information on that. If you want to learn about pivot tables, I have stuff about that. If you want to learn about the data model, I have videos about that. The only one that I don't kind of have right now is DAX specific videos. And so this is kind of introducing that topic, but you'll find right away it's nothing too crazy. It's really just writing formulas. But again, if you find that all of these topics are very foreign to you and you've never heard of them, I would highly recommend that you watch those other video series before you go on to this one, because I'm not going to be going into a ton of those object details. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is I want to be able to take the two tables that you see in front of me, and I want to load them into our workbook data model. So what that's going to require us to do is we're going to have to create references to each one of those tables, and then we're going to have to add them to the connections collection that exists in our workbook. So every workbook inside of Excel has a connections collection. So all the different types of connections an Excel workbook can have. Now, in our specific example, we're going to be creating a worksheet connection, but it's important to know that that collection of connections doesn't have to be just worksheets. It can be text files, web files, Power Query stuff, all sorts of different stuff. All right, let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete everything because if we start trying to insert, it's going to get a little bit chaotic. I also, just as an FYI, I did increase the font size for those of you who might have trouble seeing. I wanted to make it where it's very readable for people to see the information. And so I'm hoping that you guys can now see it a lot clearer. Please let me know in the comments if that is the case. I want to make sure that everyone can see the content. Now, give me 1 second. I need to plug myself in. I just realized that my thing was unplugged. Where is it? There we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do from here is I'm going to go to my developer tab and then my Visual Basic icon. Now you can see I already have some code written out, but we're going to insert a new module. So over in your Project Explorer, this little guy right here, you're going to click that modules folder, right click, then do Insert and then Module. Now with this one, it's kind of covering different topics. So I just called it Working with Analysis. Now I already have a module, so I need to give this one a different name. So I'm going to call it Video. Okay, so we're going to call this sub Working with Analysis. I don't know why I called it that, but it is what it is. Okay, first things first is we're going to declare our variables. FYI, there is going to be a lot. Okay, so the first one that we're going to do is we're going to do our workbook. So this represents the actual Excel workbook that you're currently in. And then we're going to reference individual worksheets. So I'm going to have one for my table. So I'll call this my table sheet. This will be a worksheet object. Then I'm going to also have a pivot sheet, This will represent another worksheet object. I want to make sure that's consistent. Alrighty. And then from here, I'm going to have an Excel book connection. Okay, so this is going to represent the connections collection. I've already talked about this. This contains all the connections existing in this workbook. It can be text files, web queries, it could be Power Queries, it can be worksheet connection, workbook connections. These all are the connections. Now, in our particular situation, we are going to have a workbook connection. I kind of call these a little bit weird because I technically see them as referencing a worksheet, but when you see them, you'll notice that they're going to actually reference a workbook, but we're just being very specific and say, hey, we want this worksheet from that workbook, but it's technically considered a workbook connection. Now, here comes the fun stuff. So now we're going to be getting to Power Pivot specific object variables. The first one is going to be called model. This represents the Power Pivot model that exists in every workbook. So every workbook has, again, a Power Pivot model. Additionally, we've seen in a series done a long time ago that we can have columns that we can specify in a model table. And so our model table is made up of columns, and we can have individual columns that we can reference from that model table. Again, if this sounds very confusing, please make sure you watch the other series. Okay, and then from here, we're going to have another one called product name column. This will be a model table column as well. So a single column in a table that exists in our Power Pivot model. Okay, then from here, we're going to have our measures collection, This will be our model measures. So these are basically different calculations we can do inside of our Power Pivot model. So maybe we want to take data from two different tables and then calculate a new metric or measure based off of those two columns. And so the model measures collection represents all the measures inside of our particular Power Pivot model. And then if I want to reference a single measure, and guess what? It's model measure. Okay. So then from here, I'm going to specify my list objects. I'm going to say Excel list objects. And then this will represent our list objects collection. And then I'm going to give me some space so you guys can see. We're going to have our Excel list object sales. This will be a single list object, so a single list object from that collection. And then we're going to have list object products. And then this will again represent a single list object. Now we are going to be taking those list objects, we're going to be adding them to our Power Pivot model. We're going to be calculating some metrics. And then once we have all of that information, we're going to create a pivot table. So now we got to start declaring our variables for our pivot tables. Well, what do we need to create a pivot table? We need a pivot cache. So we create a pivot cache object. And then with that particular pivot cache, we're going to create a pivot table from it. Now I'm going to give this one pivot table model so I know I can easily reference it. But again, we're going to take a cache, we're going to create that pivot table from that cache. Now, when we start working with Power Pivot, we have fields that are a little bit different. We're not going to be working specifically with pivot fields. In this situation, we're going to be working with something called cube fields. Now, these are kind of like pivot fields, but it's a little bit different because we are using our Power Pivot model in order to create our particular pivot table. And so because of that, we can have multiple tables we can pull from. So the way VBA, or more specifically Excel, looks at that is it's a little bit different. It's not just a single table where it's a field from that table. In fact, what we're really saying is this is kind of like a cube-oriented database where we can pick and choose from different tables and start combining them. So it gives it a different nomenclature, but you'll notice they behave very similar to pivot fields. We're just being a little bit more specific to the type of data source we are working with. Okay, so then from here, what do we need to do? Well, now we're going to start setting references to each of the objects we need. So in this case, I'm going to set a reference to the book, the workbook. We'll call this Excel book. And guess what? That's going to represent this workbook. This workbook. And that workbook is the one that we are currently writing this code in. Then in this workbook, we're going to grab the connections collection. So we're going to say set Excel book connections equal to Excel book connections. Okay, so we have our connections collection. And then from here, what we're going to do is we are going to grab the workbook power pivot model. So we're going to set Excel model equal to Excel book. And guess what? There's a model property that returns the power pivot model. So now we have a reference to that model. Then from here, we're going to reference our specific sheet. So grab the sheets. In this situation, we're going to have our Excel table sheet equal the Excel book. We're going to go into that worksheets collection, and then we're going to grab that tables sheet. Additionally, we're going to grab that pivot sheet. Same logic. We're going to go into our book, then we're going to go into our worksheets, and then we're going to grab that pivot one. Okay, and then a couple more things. We're going to now grab our list object collection. Grab the list object collection from our table sheet. So I'm going to set my Excel list objects collection equal to my Excel table sheet. There is a list objects property that returns the collection. Now I'm going to grab those specific tables. Grab the sales table. Now I gave my tables some names, so that makes my life a lot easier. I always recommend people give their table objects names, or else you are setting yourself up for some severe confusion down the road. Use that item method. And then from here, I'm going to do F sales. And then I'm going to grab the product table as well. Grab the product table. And then from here, we're going to say Excel list object products equals Excel list objects dot item, and then D products. How long has the video been going on? If it's going on too long, I'm going to cut it. Okay, we'll do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tables first, cut off the video. Next video, we're going to start adding the connections and then grabbing the columns and doing kind of the more complicated stuff. So again, if you really don't have to watch this part if you don't want, unless you just want to explore the data set a little bit more. But just to give you an idea of basically what are we trying to do, right? So we can clearly see we have two tables worth of data. The information in this data, though, is related in a certain fashion. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look in my table, this particular table is called sales, so F sales, my sales table. I have a column called products. In this other table called D products, it also has another column called product name. But we can see that both of these columns are related in a fashion because they both contain the same values. Now, what we can do is we can create a relationship between these two tables based on these two columns. And what it will allow me to do is I can pull in information from this table into this table. That's very helpful because what it will allow me to do is I can calculate different metrics using the information in this table combined with the information in this table. So for example, I could take my units sold and times it by my price to give me the total sales or total revenue. So that's what we're going to be doing behind the scenes using VBA and using our power pivot models. We're going to take these two very small tables and demonstrate how we can create a relationship from those two tables. Now, if you were to do this in a manual fashion, there's actually a couple of different ways you could do it. You could actually load both of these into Power Pivot directly. You could do it through Power Query as well. Or if you wanted to do it in a more old-fashioned way, you could go to the Data tab. And then if you go to the Data tab, under the Data Tools, you'll notice there's an icon that represents relationships. If you click relationships, this is where you can add relationships inside of your workbook. So for example, if I wanted to create a new relationship, I just need to specify the tables. Now it's going to provide the tables that are in the current workbook. So I could say, hey, take my products, take my sales table, and I want to create a relationship based off of these two columns. And so this would do that. And then additionally, what it's going to be doing is it would add both of those tables to the data model. So a lot of stuff goes on behind the scenes when you use this little dialog box, but it's a very powerful feature because it allows you to do some pretty complex analysis when needed. Now, with that being said, we are officially done with this first video. If you have any questions regarding Power Pivot and all that kind of fun stuff, by all means, put them down in the comments below and I will do my best to get back to you. In our next video, we are going to create our relationships inside of our Power Pivot model. And then we're going to also add our connections to our different tables and then create some measures. And then hopefully, if we have time, we can create the pivot tables from that. If not, we will save that for video 3. So with that being said, we will see you in the next video.